All right, looks like we're live.
Yeah.
I'm here, Josh Porman, with my friend Johnny Nelson, back for, I guess, what we're saying is episode 2 of the Civics Ain't Dead podcast.
That's right. Yeah. And you
So
can't doge the facts today, Josh. You cannot doge the facts.
well, we've spoken privately about how we want to embrace being corny, and you've started out on good footing with that. Yeah, I mean, how are you doing?
it was a wild week again. It's honestly it's exhausting to try to keep up with the news and two kids and a job all at the same time. Um, so we're recording this again in the afternoon. You see that I'm outside, even though it's cold this week in Texas, and that's because it's nap time for the kids. The kids inside, so this is kind of how we do it, though. We got to fit it in between stuff, right, Josh? What's with your family?
Well, they're at a birthday party for one of Jane's friends right now, so I was, being the good dad that I am, decided to not go. Um, there's some important stuff going on, right? I mean, I'll just say I'll ask you to show off your new microphone that
Oh yeah,
you're
yeah.
wearing.
So we got feedback from some of the listeners because this is a raw and fairly unedited podcast that maybe a little bit better audio would help. So I dug out
Yeah.
this microphone that I had for other purposes, and we're going to be using it. We're going to be using it now. So hopefully this improves the sound quality, even though we've still got
For
wind
one of us,
for
for
one of
one of us.
us. Yeah. Well, the
The
one.
other one will be purchasing one, I guess, now shortly.
There you go. I'll send you the link. This is an affordable option, Josh. Um, so we're trying, folks. We're listening to feedback, and and we're gonna have more actual meat this time. That's what we were talking about before we hit the record button, right, Josh? Like, I know last time we just kind of like ranted and raved about.
It was a lengthy preamble, and now the pressure's on that we've
That's
got to
right.
heat ourselves up to potentially, watch the train fly off the tracks. But
So
yeah, yeah.
yeah, tell us what's on the agenda today, Josh. You're the organized one of the two, as anyone who knows both of us will attest to. Um,
Yeah, no comment on that. So, um, so we kind of talked internally. We thought logically, let's do a week on Doge and some of the domestic stuff going on, and then we'll get into some foreign policy stuff later. But yeah, today's Doge, and what an overwhelming kind of Byzantine, confusing place to start, right? Like if we're
yeah,
trying to like get our feet wet, we're kind of you just have to jump right into the
the deep pool.
deep pool of all of it. And by no means will we give any sort of comprehensive overview of every single thing that Doge and the Trump administration is doing. That would be impossible. And maybe that's what they want people to try to do and then just get burnt out. So we're going to try to stick to the big questions that we think need answered with Doge and certainly get into some specifics because you have to, but not by all means not all of them. So before we do that, there's a couple things I want to talk about that I think are relevant. One is, I'm sure people have heard in various capacities this concept of what Steve Bannon has called muzzle velocity. And I think this is very pertinent for Doge specifically because of the fact that all of us are kind of finding out in real time, almost hour by hour, like, hey, what's the next agency on the docket? What's the next thing that's about to get axed in some capacity? So back in 2019, Steve Bannon is being interviewed, and he kind of lays out what he means by muzzle velocity. And so I'm just going to read a little quote of his about this. So this is Steve Bannon, one a former Trump advisor. I said, all we have to do is flood the zone. Every day we hit them with three things. They'll bite on one, and we'll get all the stuff done. Bang, bang, bang. These guys will never be able to recover, but we've got to start with muzzle velocity. So it's this idea that if they just come out with executive order after executive order, and as he says, flood the zone,
Yeah,
the way the media system is set up, they have to try and cover all of it.
Hmm.
even though we know they're not covering all of it, but
Right.
it'll be hard for everyone to keep up in the
Yeah.
media and then certainly people consuming media.
Right.
So yeah, I
Well,
mean, you
yeah.
don't
I
want
mean, think about how you consume media. I know how I do it. Right. It's like a couple minute increments. When I've got a spare minute, I pull up my news app. Right. Or you know, our parents' generation, they turn on the cable TV, and whatever's scrolling on the bottom for that 5 minutes between the next thing, that's what they see for the day, right? And that's what Bannon's talking about here. It's like drinking out of a fire hose. You can't get it all.
yeah. And the implication is they'll be able to maybe sneak through some stuff that falls through the cracks, or maybe stuff that really people should be up in arms about just gets kind of normalized and forgotten because we're already on to the next thing.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah. The other analogy I think of with this is like, you remember the old game Sharks and Minnows, like elementary school Sharks and Minnows, right? There's always like one shark to start with, right? And like all the minnows rush, and sure, the shark grabs like half of them, but some of the stuff gets through, right? And that's exactly what he's talking about with these executive orders, right? So you send 15 ridiculous executive orders, people overreact to the three most flashy ones, right? Um, and then the rest of it, does it flies under the radar. People don't notice it, or they're too tired to look at it, react to it by the time it comes through. The other side of that Bannon doesn't mention in his strategy there that you were quoting from is that Trump himself is the master of then sprinkling in the extra static, which is the tweets, right? It's the X posts, it's the Truth Social stuff, because there you don't even know whether it's official policy. You don't know whether this is a real declaration, right? I mean,
Hmm.
this past week, as we're recording, and this is not the topic of the day, so we won't dwell on it, but sending out the ridiculous message, long live the king, with the like dolled up image of him with a crown. That was, on one hand, he's just like teasing people to overreact. And at the other hand, he's probably at the same time issuing literal executive orders about important things, but everyone's reacting to the glitz and glamour of Trump's
Yeah,
over the
figuring,
top tweets. Yeah.
yeah, what's the signal and what's the noise?
Yeah. It's really
And
hard to
that
keep track
really,
of. Yeah.
it speaks to, I think, a larger issue that we'll get into in another episode about kind of trolling and memes and kind of
Yeah.
this
The
idea
whole
that like a lot of people say stuff and there's some intent behind it, but there's a cover, there's a smoke screen. They can say like, "Oh, I'm just joking, right? I'm joking."
Yeah, yeah. You
So
liberals you're taking it too seriously. That's the like
exactly.
ongoing phrase, and then it's like, well, yeah, but is Trump taking it seriously? Is Elon taking it seriously? Maybe, right?
And Doge fits in there perfectly because Doge kind of started as a meme of sorts, right? Coming out of
Yeah,
the Bitcoin cryptocurrency and um, it's like the play on words of like Department of Government Efficiency. It's oh that wow, what a coincidence. That's Doge. That's all right. Of course, and so it's like there's already from the get-go this air of like, nah, it's not really I mean it's a real organization, but it's not really legit. And I mean, who knows like, you know, how serious it all is. And as we found out now, it's quite serious. But there might have been a bit of like initial, well, it's not even like real. So do we need to worry about it?
right.
And the answer is yes. I think we do. As we're all finding out in the past few weeks. Um, so I mean, one more thing. One of my guiding frameworks for understanding the past 10 years of American politics is a pretty simple notion, but certainly one that's highly charged. And it's in trying to understand the current iteration of the Republican Party, or I guess you could say in trying to understand MAGA.
Yeah.
My framework that I always start with is the idea that every accusation they make is actually a confession, and
Hmm.
that much of the party politics is based on projection. What they're accusing the Democrats of, what they're accusing the liberals of, um,
Is what
is
they want to do, right? Yeah,
actually more reflective of kind of their designs and their plans. And again, I'm saying that's charged because if I was like a big Trump supporter and I heard that, I'd be very defensive in hearing that. And I'm eager and looking forward to like kind of tackling that idea on a case by case basis, and by no means just like expecting people to believe it. But
Yeah.
that is something that I've kind of used in my mind to just understand, well, okay, where are they coming from here, and what is the game plan behind all the noise.
Yeah.
So this today, I think we'll get into maybe case study one of that idea with Doge. And I think we've kind of talked internally about like, whoa, okay, so how are we going to tackle this at a 20,000 foot level? And there's really, I think, four questions that we've come up with that we need to discuss in sequential order. And so just before we dive in, the four questions we want to ask are number one, what is the federal bureaucracy, right? Um, I think a lot of people in the country think it's this awful thing that needs dismantled, and a lot of people in the country think it's what in part makes us a civilized society, right? So let's define what is this bureaucracy we're talking about, and who's in it. And then the second question, which is maybe the easiest of them to answer, is what is Doge doing? Like, what are they actually trying to eliminate? What agencies, what programs are they trying to axe? And we obviously, as I said, we can't be comprehensive, but we'll try to give a kind of a 20,000 foot overview. And then after that, I think the two really important questions are how are they doing it and why are they doing it,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
And
To
that's
what
where,
end? Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So with all that being said, that was a lengthy intro, but I think it's probably best to just dive in. And so this first question of what is the federal bureaucracy? I mean, how do you want to kind of start that conversation?
Well, I think I mean, we're historians, and I particularly am interested in early American history, right? So my gut answer to that is to say, like, well, where did it start, right? I'm always interested in origins. So obviously, the federal bureaucracy has grown exponentially since we became a country, and a lot of people see that as a bad thing. And there's certainly kind of an instinctual impulse there to say, well, why is there so much bloat, or why has it grown so much? We can talk about that in detail, but it starts as a kind of a premise in the Constitution, right? There's not a whole lot of bureaucracy when they're setting up the U.S. Constitution. It's a much smaller country. It's a much smaller government. It's also, there's a lot fewer people that are voting constituents in that country in 1787 as they're kind of putting this all into place, right? So um, it really it comes out of the Constitution because the framers in the Constitution at least anticipate that there will be the need for offices and agencies that they cannot yet anticipate, right? And so they kind of leave the door open for bureaucracy, essentially unanticipated bureaucracy, and that's the so-called, people call it the fourth branch of the government, right, in a derogatory kind of way, but that's essentially the door that the framers leave open when they write the Constitution. So Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, right, says basically the Constitution is laying out that there's kind of broad discretion of Congress here to establish various offices, right, of the federal government, across the federal government. And as with everything in the Constitution, there's a checks and balances to the three branches, right? So Congress is in the legislative branch. They're the ones that get to decide and create and establish these needed offices. That is balanced out then, right, by the executive branch, i.e., the president, who gets to fill those offices with leadership, right? So this is where we get the cabinet, but that's a separate clause. But what we do get is the ability of the president to say, okay, you've created now the National Park Service, Congress, right? And so now I'm going to people it with leadership. But even there, right, the president does have to run some of those by Congress and get congressional approval, congressional vetting, even the ones lower level that he doesn't have to get that approval from, it's still Congress that's setting up the actual bureaucratic offices, right? So that's how it's supposed to work in a balanced system where the legislation and the executive branches are playing off one another to kind of create bureaucracies as needed. So, and that's where all the bureaucracy kind of grows out of, right? Is that
Mhm.
one clause there in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the Constitution. And obviously, right, the government has had to create many bureaucracies since then, or kind of bureaucratic bodies using this kind of clause
Mhm.
in the Constitution.
Yeah. And just thinking back to some of my arguments or conversations I had with advisors in grad school, there's kind of two competing ways of thinking about the bureaucracy. One is that there's it builds up and then it scales back down and like, for like wartime, for example.
Yeah,
The
sure.
government bureaucracy ramping up to World War II is going to explode and
Okay.
then it's going to scale back down and that to a certain extent that ebb and flow is true historically for the US, but there's also um, a second through line here, and it's that there has been still a gradual, just steady increase from the founding to, let's say, the middle of the 20th century,
Mm-hmm,
where
mm-hmm.
things do build up incrementally and then they stay there. And once they're there, they're kind of there for good. Um, and that second through line is really where I think if I want to call it logic, the logic from the right is coming about like we need to dismantle this. It's incrementally built up
Yeah.
years, and now it's so large and so influential, and it's all unelected bureaucrats that it needs stripped back down.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there is some truth to that. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I was going to say there is, but I would argue, right, that there are levers in place to do that, right? So Congress can eliminate um, bureaucratic offices, right? Bureaucratic agencies. That's Congress's prerogative, just like it's Congress's prerogative to create those things. Congress can eliminate those things. The other way that Congress can do this, right, and it is fundamentally Congress's role, is the power of the purse, right? So Congress is funding these things. Congress is the one that votes to approve a budget to fund various agencies in the federal government. And that's granted by the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7, which basically says that the House of Representatives, so a particular branch of Congress, um, is the one that has the ability to tax and spend the public money, right? So a president unilaterally deciding we don't need this agency anymore is not really a part of the constitutional vision, right? No matter which framer you would ask if we had him here and interviewing him, right? It's Congress's prerogative to create these bureaucratic entities. It's also Congress's prerogative to fund these bureaucratic entities. The way the president gets to control any of this is by appointing who's in charge of those bureaucratic agencies, right? So like the National Park Service, the FBI, any of those things, Department of Treasury. Some of those are cabinet level positions, some of them are lower level positions, but the president's the one that controls who's in charge of these things, and so that's where an executive power has some sway over the bureaucracy, but doesn't have final say over whether these things should get eliminated or not.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. One other thing I'll say is that as it's built up over the years, part of the reason that's happened is because we find certain things to be important
Yeah,
in a civil society now that we may not have 150 years ago.
right.
And a lot of these regulations are quite literally born out of blood
Yeah,
and you
yeah,
don't get fire safety regulations. Those sprinklers you see in every building.
yeah.
They're not there because some academic in some building is like, nah, let's find a way to spend more money and get some sprinklers. No, it's like because people burn to death in buildings,
Yes, yeah, right.
and then the government's like, oh crap.
Right. I mean, think
Well,
about
how do
the
we?
FDA, right? The FDA is a great example of this, right? There was widespread abuse and, you know, I mean, just like gross stuff going into people's food, and people were unaware of it. And so the FDA is a federal response to that concern that people are being fed things they shouldn't be fed. People are buying food that is not safely produced, right? That is either, you know, butchered in facilities that are disgusting or mixed with things that shouldn't be mixed with. Um, none of us want lead in our food. None of us want rat parts in our ground beef. And so the FDA was created to prevent that from happening. And so in 1787, that wasn't a cultural expectation of the federal government. But in the 21st century, we have that cultural expectation, right? And none of us, if we're being honest, none of us would want to eliminate all oversight of our food and drug intake, right? I don't think so. You don't, unless you're grinding your own sausage in the backyard and not going to the grocery store, you should want some kind of watchdog agency, likely the federal government, because at least it's objective, making sure that that food's safe. And that's just one example, right? Of the
Mm-hmm.
many different ways we come to expect the federal government to kind of play a role in our lives.
Yeah.
Um, Now, this is antithetical to like classic libertarianism, I understand, right? But executive overreach is also antithetical to classic libertarianism. So you can't accuse Trump of being a libertarian by any means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think in terms of looking at the totality of American history, I think really it is a lot of this goes back to the 70s and 80s. And certainly with environmental protections, you see
Mm,
this kind of surge in kind of environmental consciousness or environmental awareness
yeah.
in the 70s, and Nixon's the one who passes all of these.
Right. A
uh,
Republican president, right?
a Republican president passes, stuff on clean air, clean water. OSHA comes out of, I'm pretty sure that, I don't know if that's Nixon or not, but same general
Same
time, right?
era.
Like
Yeah.
occupational safety. These are good regulations, and no one in their right mind, especially like working class Republicans who are like have ancestors who worked in coal mines, no one in their right mind is going to say, "Oh yeah, OSHA." I don't know. And I guess to play devil's advocate, maybe even the Trump administration isn't looking at OSHA yet, but
Yeah.
well, I don't even know. Maybe I
We'll
mean,
see. We'll see. Yeah.
we'll see, right?
Yeah.
Like there are some things that you think for all Americans, OSHA should be sacred, and Social Security should be sacred. Well, I mean, we'll see, right?
Yeah.
Like,
We're a month in. We'll see.
yeah. And so I think one other thing to talk about here with the bureaucracy is like let's be honest with ourselves. Something is off with it currently in the past, let's say 10 years. Um, Stuff, a lot of this regulation, we call it red tape, grinds activity to a halt. And that's intentional. That's part of the reason why. I mean, that's
Yeah.
why it's there to slow down the tracks and to make sure like we're doing things safely before they just push through for those protections. But still, like when something is ground to a halt so much so that it's like just not getting done at all, that's a problem. And
Yeah.
I think there's this idea that like Democrats or like liberals or whatever like don't acknowledge that. Like I don't know anyone on either side of the political spectrum who's like, yeah, the government works perfectly and it's really doing a good job. Like, no, of course there's need for reform.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, if you look at like, this idea about Biden and the EV chargers, right? Like they had how many, it was like 1.5 billion or something.
Right.
I have it in my notes somewhere, but no, 7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging stations. Um, Coming out of the Biden administration, I think in like 2023. And at the end of his term, there was like a couple hundred built,
Hmm.
right? So like that begs the question, like, well, what's going on?
Yeah.
And no, the money wasn't like spent elsewhere. It's still there, but it's just it takes a long time to get through these kind of the
Red tape.
regulatory processes, right? And this is something I do in my job, like out in California, right, with the high speed rail in part, and it is like a lengthy, drawn out process, but it's done to make sure, we're not like just plundering through defunct oil wells and letting all of that leach into the ground. I mean, there's legitimate environmental and human health reasons for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and the other critique that I hear, right, is, well, okay, so the Constitution says this thing, right, that like Congress is in charge of creating these bureaucracies. They're in charge of funding them. The president's in charge of choosing their leadership. But well, Congress has abdicated that power over the years, right? They have delegated and abdicated um, the ability to do some of this stuff to the executive branch, right? And that's not an incorrect observation, right? That has definitely been a trend in the last 50 years for sure. Executive power has grown slowly, right? And in many ways, the legislative branch has ceded that power through laws, right? It has given particular powers to the president, um, including some bureaucratic powers. But what Trump is doing now by attacking the bureaucracy through executive orders rather than through legislation, that's Trump exploiting a loophole that Congress has left open rather than functioning the way the system's supposed to function, right? So that the idea that this is somehow efficient to just let DOGE go in and start cleaning house, fine, it's efficient, but our government's not supposed to necessarily work fundamentally efficiently because of all these checks and balances, because of all these safety valves you're talking about, Josh, right? And that's kind of the point of the system. I think if you asked, again, going back to the framers, I know that, we're not, none of us here are necessarily just originalists, but if we go back to the framers, they would say, yeah, it's not the most efficient system of government. That would be an absolute monarchy, or in the 20th century, a fascist dictatorship, right? But it's not meant to be efficient. It's meant to be safe. It's meant to have checks and balances. It's meant to have kind of systems in place that people follow the rules. And so
so when you
that's
say
part of the problem.
originalist, can you just, I mean,
Oh yeah, I mean the idea that we should be following the Constitution to a T based on how they meant it to be used in 1787, as opposed to like a working document that has been amended over the years, right?
what is that in relation to a strict constructionalist? Is that
Similar, right?
okay?
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly another phrase that would kind of fall in that same camp, right?
Okay.
That, um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think the more like the to kind of try to parse out the point you're trying to make there is like I think there was political capital to be had across the aisle for some sort of government reform done legally
yeah,
and and through Congress. There's a CBS poll that was released. Honestly, I don't have the specific date, but in February, uh, CBS News poll asking Democrats how they preferred their congressional reps to approach and kind of work with Trump in January, right around the time of the inauguration.
yeah.
54% of Democrats said they wanted to try to find common ground with Trump. Okay. Now, we all know how fast this stuff has been moving. By mid-February, that number had plummeted to 35%, with
Huh.
65% stating they wanted to oppose Trump as much as possible.
Interesting. Yeah,
So, again, like this idea that like, people on the left think the government's fine and the bureaucracy's working perfectly fine. Like,
yeah.
is it corrupt and fraudulent? No, it's not, and we're going to get into that real quick
Yeah.
right now. But that's like no one is against reform. Like, of
Right.
course we are. We're
Right.
all
We
on the same page there.
we want it to be more efficient. We don't like red tape, right? Bureaucracy is a negative word for a reason, right? In a lot of contexts, and yet that doesn't mean you just start going at it with a hacksaw or a chainsaw, right? Um,
Yeah.
okay, so Doge is in the news, obviously, and we're talking about Doge today. I think again, zooming back out, talking about Doge and what it's actually doing. It can get really overwhelming really quick to just hear that name every day and be like, oh my gosh, they're cutting a program here, cutting a program there. Let's panic or let's not panic, or people are panicking for no reason. Whatever your reaction is to Doge, let's just think about a few key numbers and like what they're targeting so far, right? So the first thing Doge did before it was even really an entity was kind of offer this what it calls deferred resignations, right? This buyout program to federal workers. So the idea here is to allow low and mid-level bureaucrats in the federal system to agree to resign and get paid through September. So they essentially take a buyout. Now, according to DOGE and according to the Office of Personnel Management in the White House, somewhere between 60 and 75,000 federal employees have taken that buyout. And we don't; those numbers are not hard and fast yet, I don't think. But in theory, somewhere between 60 and 75,000 federal employees will leave the federal workforce by September through this buyout program. So that's one thing DOGE did real quick
Yeah.
after Trump took
And
office.
and
Yeah,
just to kind of piggyback on that, I mean, the number, like, I mean, I've heard a couple competing things. One is that that's kind of the natural attrition rate. Like, you're going to have turnover at a
every
certain level
administration.
every
Yeah,
administration, every year. And like I heard the percentage at 3%. Like, maybe it's 3% of the federal workforce, and
yeah,
I don't know if that's true or not. But like, you're going to have that sort of turnover anyways. And a lot of people taking the deals or the buyout were people who were planning on retiring anyways.
right,
So
right.
it's not like let's not kid ourselves.
Yeah,
By and large, like, you've heard the phrase "hold the line" from federal employees. Like,
yeah.
if those are the numbers, then the line held, right?
That's true. That's true. Right. So those people were the ones eyeing the door anyway, in theory, or a large number of them were, and so they didn't have as many take the buyout as they maybe thought they would or were hoping they would, which means that Doge has then kind of escalated its firing since then. So one figure I read is that there's somewhere around 220,000 federal employees that fall under this probationary status. And in the federal government, what that means is you've been in your position for less than a year, right? So you've either just gotten a promotion or just been hired or something like that. And so you're considered probationary and therefore easier to fire. And so that's been the next kind of step of low hanging fruit as DOGE has tried to cut costs of the federal bureaucracy. They're firing many of these 200 some thousand probationary federal employees, right?
Yeah.
So
And
and
again, can I jump in there real quick?
yeah, please do. Yeah,
All right.
I
So
don't want to.
I worked for the federal government for almost 5 years, and I had I think it was 6 months probationary period.
Yeah,
And it basically is like there to so that the people hiring you make sure you know what you're doing and you're not a buffoon. And
right.
if you are, then you're going to be let go at the end of that period. But it's not like you're like testing the waters. Like, you're in your job, you're working your job. People
Yeah.
relocate, they get an apartment, they settle down for their new job, even
Mm-hmm.
when they're at the start of that probationary period. Like, that's the start of the job. So yeah,
The other like component of these so-called probationary workers are the people that have recently been promoted, right? So they're considered probationary just because they've now moved into a new role higher up. In theory, these people got promoted because they were good at what they were doing, right? And so now you're kind of cutting them off at the knees early on in their tenure in their new what role, and beginning to eliminate them from their from their jobs as well. So this is taking a hit kind of across the board, right? And they've been going kind of piecemeal from agency to agency. Some of these agencies are quite small, right? So the numbers, for instance, Veteran Affairs, somewhere around 1,000 employees have been fired from the Department of Veteran Affairs, from what I read yesterday, anyway. But the irony is, right, these some of these people are the ones that are researchers working on cancer treatments for veterans exposed to carcinogenic elements. Some of them are working on opioid addiction among veteran populations. Some of them are working on burn pit exposure. So people with long-term health effects from burn pit exposure. So these are not like made up desk job people, right? These are people in key places like Veteran Affairs who are working on veterans' health issues, right? And we've all seen kind of the you know headline grabbing stuff about, well, they fired some nuclear scientists and then they had to rehire them, right? Or they fired the people at the CDC working on avian flu and then had to go back and track these people down. Like, those are the kind of the attention grabbing ones, right? But it's really, I mean, it's happening across the board. And Josh, you have some other statistics maybe about veterans affairs. Does that sound right?
Well, just I mean, just generally, like we have to ask the question: Who are federal like
Yeah.
civil servants? Who are the people working for the government? Because again, there's this idea that they're like ideologically driven. Like you
Right.
couldn't find in a lot of these things, in a lot of these agencies, you couldn't find less ideologically driven people
Yeah.
to do these jobs. They're very menial jobs, very important, basic jobs needed to run society.
Yeah.
But there's really it's not they're not political. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
and also like let's be very frank, the federal government is a major employer of veterans,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
30% of the federal workforce is veterans,
Right.
16% of which is disabled veterans.
Right.
So, you want to talk about Republican values. Uh,
Yeah.
find me a Republican who's like, yeah, I'm not a big fan of veterans. If they've got a, arm amputated in a battle, like they like, nah, like go to the private sector, man. Like get a like come
Well,
what are we doing?
and that's the like dismissive tone. I don't know how in the weeds people have been about how these firings have gone about, but many of them, if you've been following them, they happen on, Friday night at 11 p.m. Right. So the so-called Valentine's Day massacre is where they fire all of these Department of the Interior people. Somewhere around 5,000, right, initially were fired in the Department of the Interior. That included 1,000 people in the National Park Service, right? Plus a bunch of temporary summer workers and people in national forests and places like that. Um, and they did that on Friday night of Valentine's Day, in like dismissive emails that people should go find something better to do with their lives, right? That's one of the phrases that has been in some of these emails from DOGE to people that are getting fired from careers they're quite passionate about and things that are quite nonpartisan. I think again, if you polled the average American likes veterans. The average American also likes national parks. And
Yeah.
so that's going to be a problem, right? That you've now fired a large, like a decent chunk of people working in National Park Service and the interior, and I mean the list kind of runs on from there, right? And like Josh said, we don't want to go through everything, but you could look up your agency of choice and see how many thousand jobs or hundreds jobs or tens of thousands of jobs before it's over have been cut from these things, and it's not ideologues, right? These are career bureaucrats, right? Which I know sounds like a negative term, but they're just like everyday people, either researching science or
Right.
working working a desk somewhere or working in a national park. I don't know. It seems to be indiscriminate in a way, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.